Okay, so can you see my screen now? If I could just get a feedback there. Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. So navigating harm reduction through land-based practices on the Trapline. And this is a picture of me with my elder and another community member who is also an elder and her daughter and her um, grandchild. And the interesting thing about here is they're they thanked me after this presentation, and I'm like, no, I should be thanking you. And this is the beautiful reciprocal relationship that I have with the elders in my community. It wasn't always that way to begin with. This is a relationship that's been nurtured over a period of time. But of course, you can see that I'm outside. I'm using my feather. We're sitting in a circle. There's lots of practices that are already happening here. But just get into the meat of the program. So I wanted to start with a welcome, and I'm on Treaty 8 and Treaty 6 territory here, and I'm pretty sure that you're situated on Treaty 4. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm acknowledging that land that, that we're standing on. I really wanted to thank CAAN for, we put in a proposal because we thought we had something to share and say, and they agreed. So that was always wonderful. And I always want to thank the elders, the past, the present, and the future. Those elders that we have now, the knowledge seekers like myself, and then the seekers, the ones that are just learning, and they're going to be our elders in the future. And so I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that as well. And so then, who is Matricia Bauer? Why is it important for you to zoom in and listen to me for an hour? Well, my life story's been a rather long one. Very similar to, I think, a lot of Indigenous people. My grandmother went to my mother went to residential school, Jussard. I'm from Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation. So Tansei Sinawaka Isko-achitaw Wachinitzigetsun is my traditional name. And I'm Nêhiyaw, and I speak Nêhiyawin. And Warrior Women is a collective of educators and storytellers, jingle dancers. We have people who make, world-winning bannock, and our moccasin makers and glove makers and beaters. And you can see this is a picture. I love this T-shirt. Go smudge yourself. Anyway, on one side is my daughter, Mackenzie, and on the other side is a friend of mine. And we are all educators and present and drum, sing, and really, my tagline for Warrior Women is changing the world one drumbeat at a time. And the Cree word for warrior doesn't mean like soldier or, somebody who fights. It's fighting in a way that where we stand up for our culture. So warrior actually in Cree means one who stands up for their community. And so that was important for me. So last week, Mackenzie talked, or not last week, but the last session, Mackenzie talked a lot about harm reduction in sort of a practice that you would have gone to university for, which is what she got her degree in, is child and youth care. And harm reduction is discussed a lot in that. My harm reduction is more sort of practical knowledge and land-based knowledge. And so I really wanted to go through that because as normal as that sounds to go outside and do activities, it is something that is really not promoted. And there is an inherent risk that a lot of school groups don't want to take advantage of. Therefore, corralling, 40 and or more kids into a classroom and teaching them en masse has become more of a practical thing to do. But most Indigenous children will really not flourish in that particular format. And we know that because of the historical story of residential school. It's actually been harmful. So how do we flip that narrative around? How do we decolonize the school space? Well, one thing we can do is we can literally get outside, and this has shown just massive benefits in lots of different ways, and we're going to walk through that a little bit. All of the pictures that are on the presentation are pictures of my trapline or me doing nature-based activities, and they're all ones that are mine. So I'd like to talk about how the trapline came to be. So this is a funny story because I'm from Jasper, and Jasper, Alberta is home to 21 different Indigenous groups, and they were all evicted when they created the national park, and they kind of went all four directions. And the interesting thing about this is the Moberleys actually had a trap line outside of the Jasper area because it wasn't like Jasper National Park. It was just the sort of the Yellowhead region. And it got sort of purchased over and over again by Indigenous people or kind of passed on. And a woman named Lena, who was Indigenous, had the trap. My partner had wanted to buy it when he was 19 and he just couldn't afford to do it. Just couldn't afford, the money. And we drive out to the trap line, I bet you, all the time. He would show me the land. And when I was 19, I was going to buy this trap line. And I was in Jasper about 2 years ago, and I opened up Facebook, and there was a Facebook ad for somebody selling a trap line. And I recognized the picture. It was Cal's trap line, the one that he never got a chance to buy. Now, Cal is 60 years old. He's my partner. And so he has literally been pining over this land for 40 years. And so I sent him a message and I said, the trap line is up for sale. And he literally drove over to the owner's house that day and negotiated settlement. There was 4 other people who had already made an offer, but the person that had it really wanted it to go back to somebody who is Indigenous. And so that's how we came to buy the trap line, which I really think is just a remarkable story about how much he loved that land and how much he wanted it and how he finally, was able to purchase it. So it was great. So we co-own the trap line together. Also, my grandfather, he's from Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, the one in Alberta, northern Alberta, and north of Valley View, and it's beautiful land there, tons of wildlife. And he had a huge trap line, probably 20 kilometers, and about 4 different cabins. And he worked his entire life up there on the trap line, and he eventually died on the trap line. And so there's that familial connection with me and the trap line too. It's just like, I think it's just in my lifeblood. It's interesting that CAAN has a canoe metaphor because that metaphor is one that is, outside. It's a canoe. It's literally a mode of transportation. And what is that transportation that we're trying to navigate? Where are we're trying to go? We're trying to navigate through harm reduction and healing. And so it's a good metaphor. And I love the fact that it's already outside. So you're already embracing that, sort of outdoor connection. And that mode of transport that was so important to Indigenous people, especially people on the trap line. That's how all of our furs were negotiated from one area to the next. So this is our trap line here in this little area. And it's along a very busy highway, which is good for us. It's only 15 minutes outside of Hinton and 15 minutes from the gates of the national park. So it's literally in between where Cal and I live. And it's by quite a busy little airport that mostly has helicopters and small flight planes coming in. And it is incorporating quite a bit of wetland, and it has 2 lakes on it as well. So, slide 4. So Indigenous people are best outside, right? If we had to decolonize our practices, we would literally take them outside. Indigenous people historically spent very little time inside. Most of our livelihood meant that we were hunting, we were fishing, we were trapping, we were processing, we were cooking, we were, making dry meat, we were harvesting. All of these practices were outside, and so now for us to be inside, it's just not within our nature. It doesn't seem normal. And you can even see the painting behind me. Even if I am inside, I try to bring nature inside with me. And so it probably doesn't surprise anybody that most of my nature-based journaling is around flowers and flora. I'm an Indigenous herbalist, and I'm also a tea sommelier. And so majority of the work that I do is getting people outside and into the flora and discussing the fauna, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So cultural connection is through land-based practices, harm reduction, and community healing, and we'll get into those a little bit more as we go along. So this is my partner. He immediately looks happy because we're on the trap line. We're both extremely happy on the trap line, and we're not fancy. We're just, we're out there, we're doing our work, we're baiting, we're trapping, we're checking traps, we're, gathering, we're seeding, we're setting up garden boxes for the next year or putting up pine marten boxes. But there's an awful lot of work to do on the trap line. It's every day, and it's quite enjoyable work. So the CAAN philosophy, there's three major points to it. There's empowerment, there's education, and there's culturally relevant resources. And the reason why land-based teaching fits this model so well is because when you get out there on the land and you teach kids how to start a fire or how to cut wood or any of these like sort of outdoor things, you give them empowerment, right? They get to control their environment. And that doesn't happen very often. Usually when you walk into a classroom, you're told where to go, what to do, to sit down and be quiet. Whereas we're exactly the opposite when we take kids outside. We're like, okay, here's an axe, it's super dangerous. Here's a fire, it can really hurt you. Like we're exposing them to things where they have to use their judgment, and they're constantly evaluating and reevaluating their practices out on the land. And this, is an education as well, right? It's a pretty interesting education, because if you don't get the fire going, then we don't get tea, and we're going to be quite cold, right? So everything has a consequence, and it's usually a pretty good one. I remember the kids waking up on the trap line, and one of the boys came and said, "When's the coffee and tea going to be ready?" And I said, "Well, is there a fire going?" And he's like, "No, I couldn't find any of the wood." And I said, "Well, I think you guys burnt all the kindling last night." And he said, "Yeah, we did." And I said, "Well, here's an axe." Because literally we have to get a fire going in order to get the water boiling, in order to get the tea and the coffee going, and in order to start breakfast. And so they had stayed up late the night before, and instead of burning, regular wood, they just burnt all the kindling, which was a major consequence the next day. And they ended up spending an hour cutting up more kindling. And the next night, they didn't burn the kindling because they knew that they were going to need it for the fire, and the fire starting the next morning. So these sort of natural based consequences, even just around something simple as building and maintaining a fire, are really important. So this is a ridiculous picture too. I'm ridiculously happy. My daughter's ridiculously happy. And her husband in the background, who's doing the muskrat, is ridiculously happy. Now, he's not just white. He's the whitest person I know. He's a redhead. And so he wears SPF 1000 when he's outside, even if the sun is barely out. But Mackenzie and I, you can see we're doing beavers, and Lucas in the background is doing muskrat. We all took our trapping course. We all took it together, and we've been processing hides for a really long time, but we just didn't officially have our trapping license. So this is where I'm messy, and this is extremely hard work, but this is also where I'm happiest, and I'm also with my family. So these cultural connections really bind us together. And we talk about this a lot. And this is one of my favorite pictures, actually. And it was just sort of taken whimsically by my partner. So when we talk about the impact of colonization and historical trauma, I think this is a story most of us are fairly familiar with. And if we aren't, we should be. But, colonization basically took us out of our land and put us into very, very small spaces. So when you think of how large Canada is, Indigenous people are on uh, 0.05% of the land. So we're on less than 0.5% of the land, which is, if you put all of the reservations together, it would be less than 0.5%, which is, obviously barely anything. So we were really removed from our landmass. We were taken away from being like nomadic. We were taken away from hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering our own foods. And we were put into reservations where we were given blankets, where we were given food. And the food that we were given wasn't nutritious. It was bread. It was things that we weren't used to. So we weren't getting the vitamins, the nutrition. We weren't doing the lifestyle that we were used to. And of course, this led, and then our children were taken away and institutionalized. And this kind of brings us to where we are today, where we're trying to decolonize ourselves. And the easiest way to get to doing that is literally by opening up the front door and walking outside. So this cultural disconnection has contributes to mental health and addiction challenges. These are intergenerational traumas. I think your organization, I don't have to talk about this very much because you're pretty familiar with mental health. In fact, you're in the area of like trying to prevent it. This outside presentation is just giving you another modality and a way of thinking about taking people from being inside and putting them outside. And Whereas people think that's risky, it's actually the absolute opposite. It allows people empowerment and judgment and vitamin C even, and vitamin D from the sun. Like there's just so many benefits to being outside, and I'm going to list a couple of those as well. I just want to be really conscious of where I am. So land-based practices, just wanted to back up and just kind of list through what some of those land-based practices are. And I know I talked about that a little bit. I just have some notes, which I can forward on to you as well if you think that would be helpful. So land-based practices are food gathering, medicinal plants, natural resources like willows for dream catchers, hunting, fishing, trapping, ceremony, storytelling, traditional arts and crafts, medicine walks, canoeing, snowshoeing, skiing, tracking, controlled burning, fire safety, sustainable harvesting, cabin building, teepee raising, and fort building. And there's probably lots more in there that I forgot. Like I didn't even put in tea ceremonies or food preparation, but all of these practices are things that we do on the Trapline, and we share them with different groups that come out, school groups, adult groups, family groups, tourists, gap year programs. And every time a group comes out, they walk away a little differently than they came onto the land. And there's a different appreciation for the land, and there's a different respect, and within themselves as well. And so I think that when we talk about reclaiming our cultural identity, there's a lot of kids that don't feel very comfortable in their everyday lives. And if you're Indigenous, you always feel a little bit like a square peg fitting into a round hole. And when people come out onto the land, it's just like they breathe a sigh of relief, like, oh, the land doesn't judge me. The plants don't judge you. The trees don't judge you. They are literally called a stand, a group of trees. They stand with you, and the flowers and the plants, they are your relatives, and the land has spirit. Literally, every Indigenous person that stands on Turtle Island, they stand on the bones of their ancestors, right? So that land is made up of 10,000 years of our people that are still in that story. That land is a healing thing, that Mother Earth, that Turtle Island. And Turtle Island is even in your, in the CAAN, has the turtle on there. So there's already these, pieces of cultural identity that people are trying to, adhere to. And when they're out on the land, they can smell it, they can see it, they can feel it. And that heartbeat that we're always searching for, that drumbeat, is already there for us. And we just have to allow ourselves to experience it. And by getting out onto the trap line and showing people how they can truly live outside, really just connects them with their cultural integrity. Okay, slide 7, and I have a few notes. No, just going to put that out here. So, explain how Indigenous teaching provides a framework. Well, I mean, there's lots of different frameworks, right? There's body, mind, and spirit. That's, teaching about the braid. There's the 7 sacred teachings. There's the 4 directions of the medicine wheel. So you can use whatever framework you want as far as teaching kids outside. But there's something about like the 4 directions when you're actually outside and you make the kids actually turn into those 4 directions, right? You're actually facing north. It's not just a picture on a wheel, right? You're actually facing south. You can feel the south wind. You can feel the north wind. You can, see the sun rising in the east, and you can see it setting in the west, right? These are things that you actually notice when you're outside. And so it's one thing to show people a picture of a wheel and say, this is north and this is south, but is it really north? Because you're pointing up into the sky, right? So it's really interesting to get kids outside, give them a compass, and actually show them. You can talk about, body, mind, and spirit, but when you're outside and you're picking sweetgrass and you're actually braiding it, then you're actually braiding body, mind, and spirit, right? And so having these frameworks are great, but being outside, you can really show kids what that actually means, like in real time, and they appreciate that. You can see I'm ridiculously happy with this. This was 10 days of hide tanning. It's a buffalo. It's huge. It was just an immense amount of work. We look happy now because I don't think we knew what we were getting into. But that was like a transformational experience for me. It was right after the fires here in Jasper, and I was already emotionally and spiritually open, and I just got to experience this beautiful hide tanning project with people and doing the same thing that I love. But I think the interesting thing that this particular experience taught me was community, and that I shouldn't be doing these things on my own. Often I'm out on the trap line by myself or just with my partner, and it's not meant to be like that. We're meant to be doing these practices in community, and just like a buffalo jump, an entire tribe would work towards getting those buffalo to jump off a buffalo point, and then all of the women, the children, and the men would gather at the bottom, and they would start processing. But they did it in community. It wasn't like one person chasing a buffalo and then doing the hide tanning. And I find that Indigenous people were fighting so much for our sovereignty to do these land-based practices, but we're often kind of grinding our wheels in our own little corner, and it's not meant to be like that. And so the Trapline really allowed me to gather people and gather communities and offer a space that is safe, just like today, and offer an area that's natural and outside. Okay. So yeah, we're done the hide here. You can see how grateful and how happy I am. And you can also see how big the hide is. So it was a massive, massive project to do. And we're really grateful that we got it finished. Um, but when we're talking about how stories can help individuals process trauma and find meaning, I think I wrote this down specifically. Oh, so stories, especially Indigenous stories and traditional stories, they really explain the world around us. And we've probably all heard like at least one Indigenous story that we find meaning in. But I think the one that I'd like to share with you today is the one about the buffalo. And so the word for buffalo is Pasquai Mustus, at least in the Cree dialect that I'm from here in the Y territory, the Plains Cree. And Pasquai Mustus, I mean, Pasqua means grass. And as an Indigenous herbalist, all of our sacred medicines are grasses, right? We have the sweetgrass, we have the sage, we have the cedar, we have the tobacco, and those are mostly grown on the Pasqua, on the prairies, right? So Pasquai mustus is the ungulate that eats the grasses, right? And so as much as I think I've decolonized myself and I've indigenized myself, my relationship to the buffalo was very, very small. And that is actually not a really good place to be because we are buffalo people. I'm from the Plains Cree tribe. We followed the buffalo around. We processed the buffalo. The buffalo was everything to us. And I realized I looked around, sort of where I'm at, and I had no buffalo. I had no buffalo teeth. I had no buffalo bones. I had no buffalo fur or meat even. And I just realized how far removed I was as a buffalo person from my buffalo. And so this entire hide residency really brought me back to remembering that I'm a buffalo person. And we had to do all of that outside because this kind of project, you just can't do it inside. It just was almost virtually impossible. And being outside brought us a lot of uh, problems. There was rain, there was snow, there was cold, there was heat, there was all sorts of things that we were negotiating through. But we built a fire and we just persevered. And we did get done what we wanted to get done. And we had made a lot of mistakes along the way, but we also really gelled as a group. And this was really, really a healing modality for me, especially after the Jasper fires, which were just so devastating. I wasn't even supposed to be at the program because I was going to be too busy over the summer. And then, of course, all of that changed. And then I phoned the Banff School of Fine Arts and basically begged myself into the program. Here's another picture of the buffalo. We did one, but we did two buffalo in that 10 days. One we did uh, all the hair off, and one we did with the hair on. So what the trap line means to me, connection, learning, and healing. Um, I think I've talked a lot about what the trap line means to me and how we can make connections and learning and healing. But I think the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is like when we're out on the trapline, there's always a knowledge keeper or an elder or an auntie or an uncle or a kukum or a mushum. And some people do not have those connections. They don't have, or they do have those connections. Sometimes family can be our worst enemy, right? Especially if they're not healed and they're dealing with trauma. We have to put boundaries around that place. So where else do we go, right? Where else do we go if our communities aren't in a really good healing place? Well, there are other places that groups can go, that families can go, that kids can go to, that adults can go to who are trying to re-indigenize themselves. And these are these nature-based programs, and of course, our Trapline is one of them. And so it starts and ends with what we can do out on the land. We put up a lot of Martin boxes this year. We had a couple of celebrations. We're going to be having, we call it a barn raising, but it's actually going to be putting up our cabins. We're going to be doing a teepee raising where we're going to be going through, the different teepee pole meetings. And we're really excited about that. That's going to be a good ceremony as well. I also am a certified through Forest Hub for nature journaling. I am not a forest therapist, but there are people that can take people out for forest therapy. But I am big in Indigenous herbalism. And so we do a lot of gathering and medicine making and food processing. And there's also a lot of biology that happens out on the trapline. You know, there's a lot of skin identification, there's a lot of fur identification, skull identification, tracking. So it really fits into like sort of a science modality too. So it really is this like living science that people can kind of sink their teeth into. So here's a beautiful picture. This is, where we live. I just can't believe it. We're just surrounded by this incredible beauty here in the Rocky Mountains. We do a lot of traditional activities, trapping, fishing, gathering. This promotes health in a lot of different ways. One, it gives us food sovereignty. So we're actually collecting the food. We're fishing. We're giving ourselves that nutrition. We're eating wild meat. We're processing our meat. We make a lot of sausage. We also gather a lot of traditional medicines. We collect our own sage, our own sweetgrass. We grow our own tobacco. We harvest our cedar. We tap our birch trees. We're really processing what we find out on the land. I teach kids how to make medicines. So a lot of tinctures, tonics, bitters, a lot of skin products. Like yesterday, we were making a salt scrub with cedar oil, juniper berry oil, and pine oil, and Douglas fir. And I got to tell you, it just smelled like the forest on our hands. And that salt scrub is so important right now because we're really dealing with a lot of dryness in Alberta. Traditional knowledge and building self-sufficiency and resilience. So we talked a lot about that, sort of like that fire analogy. If we get out onto the land and we can't raise the teepee, then we're sleeping outside. So, I mean, it's important for us to, even just get the trappers tents up, get the teepee tents up. Everything on the trap line has to be removable. So, other than the trappers cabin, which we can actually use for visitor experiences, but that's where we store the majority of our product when we're not using it. So Warrior Women and the Trapline 2025. This year we bought 2 new teepees, we bought 2 new tents. We're raising a new cabin, and we're also putting in a smoking shed. We've got a couple of compost toilets and a bear bin. So we're really excited to get people out on the land this year. And a lot of it is going to be basic sort of barn raising, a lot of just beginning things. And every year we get to sort of build on to that. So next year, we can start putting some platforms in, we can start putting some decks, we can start building some tables and chairs, and just thinning out the forest a little bit and adding some land-based practices in there. So one of the things that I love about getting onto the land is it combats isolation and it builds community. Usually we build 2 fires. And that's because I find that when we have large gatherings that come out, there's always one person that maybe gets a little bit overwhelmed by the gathering of people, and then they can just sort of navigate to their own spaces. There's always a place, sort of breakout space, where people can go and sit on their own. We always put a bench out in the forest so people can literally sit out there by themselves and nature journal. And there is no judgment. There's only judgment if like they haven't cut their wood, or there's certain things that everybody has to sort of contribute to. But we have a lot of space where people can also process as well. So it's not just group activities all the time. You do have the ability to like separate and process, because for a lot of people, they're not used to being outside. And so we actually had a group from Toronto, inner city kids, and they had never spent more than a couple of hours outside. And I was doing a spirit animal meditation where I got them to lie down on the ground, and they actually couldn't lie still. And finally I said, "What is going on?" And none of them, none of them had ever laid on the ground before. Like, had never gone to a beach to lay down, had never gone to a park to lay down. They had never laid down on the grass before. And it was quite incredible for me to even think that that could be a possibility. But these kids are living in high rises in the middle of Toronto, and they have like concrete playgrounds. So they were not used to being outside, and the grass felt itchy and there's bugs crawling on them, and the sun was burning their face, and they couldn't be, you know, totally black, and we wouldn't allow them to have their cell phones or their earbuds, so they couldn't relax, or they said that they couldn't relax. You know, within about 15 minutes, I had all of those kids almost sleeping. So, you know, we also do one practice where everybody goes to a place in the forest. Now, I can see everybody and I know where they are, but they can't see each other. And they just have to spend 15 minutes sitting by themselves in the forest where they can't see anybody else, and just describing everything that's around them in their journal. And for a lot of kids, they've never spent any time by themselves in the forest. And so allowing them to experience these practices is really, really important. Oh, the intergenerational knowledge sharing and mentorship. So having access to those kukums, those mushums, those aunties, those uncles, you know, those older knowledge keepers. Most of the people that are coming out onto the land are seekers. So they're seeking knowledge. They want, and they're coming in fairly green. And so they're, you know, even something as simple as learning how to make a fire, or how to boil water on the fire, make a tea, or gathering plants and knowing which ones are edible and which ones aren't. These are all like beginning activities for a lot of people. And so it's really fun to like be able to share that intergenerational knowledge with them. So land-based healing. So, I mean, I could go over examples of traditional medicines that could be gathered, like even on my dry sheet there. We've got some beautiful rose hips. We have some beautiful rose bud. We have dandelion, which is an excellent diuretic. We have some clover, which is really good for colds and flus. We have some sage, which is good for smudging, but it's also makes a wonderful tea, and it's a great spice. We have some yarrow, which is it's just stipend. It actually stops bleeding, but it also makes a really good tea, especially for women. So there's all sorts of nutrition and medicinal things that are on this tray. So even something really simple, but going out and harvesting and teaching people like what exactly is on this tray? What are things that we can do with these? How can, you know, did you realize that, you know, Indigenous people have been living on the land for 10,000 years, and they didn't have pharmacy. They didn't have Walmart. They didn't have access to doctors and nurses. They had to heal themselves. They had to know the plants and the flora and the fauna. And when Europeans came over, they met people that were extremely healthy, that were extremely athletic, that had good trade routes, that had knowledge of the skies and the stars and the flora. And we really only became sick as an Indigenous culture when we embraced the European modalities. And so in order to step away from that, we have to go back and rediscover, like, how did Indigenous people do that? And the answers are all still there. They're on the land, right? The animals are on the land. The trees are, flora is on the land. And this beautiful sacred knowledge we've forgotten, and we need to, like, I feel like it's a responsibility for me to like pass it on to the next generation, because it's been so empowering for myself. It's been such a beautiful way of learning and sharing. And it's also brought me back to my language, like even my herbology, and understanding, you know, how we understood the information on the plants. You know, the plants tell us about our culture. Fam tour. Oh, the single media tea. So I had, so a fam tour is when in tourism it's called a familiarization tour, and it's when they um, uh, bring out the heavy hitters, like journalists or social media influencers, or sellers and buyers, people who sell our product. And I had the opportunity to meet a single woman who is a journalist. And she came out onto the land, and I invited her to do a tea ceremony. And so I gathered the water and I was boiling the water and I was introducing her to the water. And she had long gray braids. And so I took her down to the river and I introduced her to the river. And how we introduce ourselves to the river is we wet our hair in the water. And I looked over at her and she was just bawling. And I said, "Oh, I said, have I done something wrong, or like, are you going through something?" And she said, "No." She said, "I've been here so many times. I've never introduced myself to the water before." And she said, "I'm just having such a powerful moment. It's totally brought me back to being with my grandmother when I was a young child. We spent a lot of time outside. She was a gardener." And she said she always drank tea. And she said, "This whole experience has just really brought me back to that place where I was happiest." And, there's always these beautiful experiences just by getting people outside and just doing these simple connections, these simple ceremonies, just like feeding the and tea and introducing to her to the water was a really powerful moment for her. And that brought me a lot of joy. Guiding principles. Oh, so my tagline is indigenizing the world one drum beat at a time. So bringing it back to warrior women. And you can see, I love this picture because it's focused on the connection, people sharing resources, and my beautiful owl fan. But indigenizing the world one drumbeat at a time, like my core principle is cultural and it's sharing. So it's educational, and I do it through all the different modalities, everything that I do in my life, whether it's speeding or moccasin making or rattle making or, fan making. I'm like, how can I share this with the people that come to see me? How, what is the lesson in this particular teaching? How can I be humble and allow people to see the beautiful parts of my culture instead of the negative parts of my culture? And we do that by being honest. We do that by sharing our own personal story. And we do that by taking people out onto the land. So building partnerships with Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations. So Warrior Women is a part of Indigenous Tourism of Alberta, but I'm also part of Indigenous Tourism of Canada. I sit on the board for Tourism Industry Association of Canada. I also sit on the Alberta Native Plant Council, just as in an advisory role. I don't actually belong to the board or the organization. I just consult them all the time. And I used to sit on the chamber board, but I was sitting on too many boards, so I had to give up a few of those. And I also sit on the fetal alcohol network for Northern Alberta. And so some of these organizations are Indigenous and some of them are non-Indigenous, but it's really important for me to be tied to my community. It's important for me to be tied to my reserve. It's important for me to be tied to being, what is being in Alberta, what is, and lately I've been questioning what it is to be Indigenous and Canadian as well. And so I really believe in partnerships. It's really helped in my organization. And it's nice to invite these partnerships out to the Trapline so that they can be happy too. So CAAN's role in advocating for Indigenous health and well-being. I'm sure that you're all in a position where you've done some counseling or you've met with Indigenous people, but it would be really nice to see if you could introduce some of those outdoor activities in this type of modality in the work that you're doing as well. So that brings me to the end, which I can't believe. I guess that's pretty good timing. It's 40 minutes exactly, which is exactly what I wanted. So my call to action for you is to explore land-based activities, practices, culture, and ceremony. And so I have these questions like, when was the last time you were at ceremony? When did you talk to your elder, your kukum, or your auntie? And where is your outside sacred spot? So these are also things that you can share and talk to with your clients because their connection to your culture and your connection to your community is extremely tied to harm reduction and your ability to negotiate. One of the things that I do in my circle of ceremony, are these relationships that I've made, not just with non-Indigenous partners, but with families and with tourists, right? They don't just leave an experience on the trap line. They leave as friends. They don't just leave giving me a handshake. They give me a hug. They don't just stay in touch. They send me Christmas cards and they put wonderful reviews on my Google and my website. And there's just something that happens that's different with an Indigenous experience when people are outside and they have maybe not an epiphany, but definitely a shift in the way that they think. So that's the importance of collective action in creating a healthy community. And hopefully I've given you something different to think about than maybe you've thought about before. But I would love to have a Q&A. And so if you don't mind, you can unmute yourself and ask me, or you can put it into the Q&A and hopefully somebody can help facilitate that for me.